He didn't resist. But because he's black, Dante Graves was shoved to the back of the courtroom, his name misspelled, his bag searched. Then it happened. Brent Rollins, the cop who killed his son, punched him in the face and smirked like it was justice served. Blood dripped from Dante's jaw. No one moved. No one spoke. But Rollins had no idea. Dante's a former Navy SEAL who survived Kandahar, and this time he didn't come to die. Watch till the end to see what happens when the silent finally strike back. The courtroom doors opened with the quiet hiss of institutional hydraulics, but for Dante Graves it may as well have been a steel trap uncoiling in silence. He stepped through without hesitation, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain white shirt that clung to his back like a flag refusing to lower. His posture was that of a man who had survived everything but forgiveness. No one acknowledged him. No nods, no words, yet every head turned, not in welcome, never in welcome, but with suspicion sharp enough to draw blood, as if his very presence scuffed the polished marble beneath their feet. The eyes tracked him, a black man moving through a temple of whiteness, alone, unarmed, but dangerous in the way silence always is. A security guard near the entrance pointed him to the back row without a word. No gesture of courtesy, no effort to find his name on the list, just the assumption, swift and automatic, that he belonged where the shadows gathered. "You'll need to sit back there, sir," the guard said, already turning away. Dante looked past him to the front benches, mostly occupied by lawyers and families of the court, people who wore grief like a uniform, polished for the camp. He said nothing, just walked down the center aisle, shoes echoing faintly, stopping only when another guard stepped forward and extended an open palm. "Stolen bag," the man said. Dante looked down at the black soft-shell case in his hand. "It's already been cleared," he said evenly. "Random check," the guard replied without looking at him, already unzipping. Inside, a worn notebook, a folded military certificate, a single Polaroid of a smiling boy, and a laminated press pass from a journalist friend who didn't survive Fallujah. The guard pawed through it with the disinterest of someone unpacking a dead man's suitcase. "Everything here?" he asked. "Not anymore," Dante said, closing the bag himself. He moved to the seat assigned to him. Back row, far end, beneath the flickering overhead light that buzzed like an old wasp nest. He lowered himself into the chair slowly, deliberately, as if lowering into a cold grave. On the folding desk in front of him was a name tag printed hastily, laminated in plastic. He picked it up. Danton Greaves. Wrong name, wrong spelling, wrong man. He held the tag between two fingers, staring at it as if it were a warning label. Then he placed it down flat, face down. He did not correct it. He no longer believed mistakes like that were accidental. Brent Rollins turned around in his seat 3 rows ahead. The cop wore a navy moon suit that still fit like a uniform, and a smirk carved into his face like it had been put there by a tattoo gun. He tilted his chin toward his lawyer but spoke loud enough for Dante to hear. "I thought he died in the desert," Rollins muttered. "Didn't they leave him buried in sand somewhere out in Kandahar?" The lawyer didn't respond. He didn't need to. The moment passed like smoke curling in a locked room. Dante said nothing. His hands stayed folded on his knees, his spine perfectly aligned, his face carved from some ancient stone no longer found in this country, but his eyes, God, those eyes. They didn't blink, they didn't flinch, they didn't even follow Rollins. They pinned him like a nail to a corkboard, indifferent to the writhing, content to wait. In the stillness, he began to notice things. The sound of heels tapping along the corridor, the click of an overused pen from the stenographer's desk, the low murmur of clerks exchanging last-minute changes, and beneath all that, the way the air seemed to bend around Rollins, how people made space for him, leaned into him, tilted toward him like sunflowers toward a polluted sun. No one asked him to sit in the back. No one misprinted his name. No one checked his bag. The judge had not yet arrived, and still the room felt decided. The wood-paneled walls leaned in with quiet judgment, and the flags behind the bench, American, state, judiciary, hung in limp submission, a country's silence sewn in fabric. Dante's gaze dropped for a moment to the edge of the desk in front of him, scratched into the wood, barely visible. "We see you." He didn't know who had carved it, but it held. The courtroom began to settle. Phones dimmed, papers shuffled into obedience. Lawyers adjusted their suits with the urgency of people preparing not for truth, but performance. Rollins leaned back, stretching his arms across the bench like a man watching a rehearsal. His lawyer handed him a folder. He didn't open it, just stared ahead at the empty bench where the judge would soon sit. Dante's shoulders moved almost imperceptibly as he exhaled. He had been here before. Not in this courtroom, not in this state, but in this position. The waiting, the silent calculation of risk and distance. The knowledge that no matter how still he sat, the room would see only a threat waiting to be contained. Kandahar taught him patience. Arlington taught him loss. This place, this trial, was teaching him something colder, how little that service bought him in the country he came home to. He touched the corner of his shirt sleeve, adjusting it as if brushing away dust, but what he felt instead was memory, the sharp crunch of desert gravel under combat boots, the thud of a body falling after a sniper's crack, the warmth of his son's breath when the boy fell asleep on his shoulder during cartoons, all gone, all locked behind the calm he wore like armor. A bailiff stepped in and called the room to order. People stood. Dante rose slowly. The judge entered, a woman in her 60s, expression unreadable. Everyone sat. Dante waited half a beat longer, then lowered himself back down, his eyes never leaving Rollins. The prosecutor began with standard procedural remarks. Names, charges, timeline, legalese, all of it a prelude. None of it mattered. Not yet. Dante glanced sideways as a court assistant passed him a packet of documents. He flipped through them mechanically, eyes pausing only when he saw a page with his name again, misspelled. Another mistake. Another miss. He made no sound, but his jaw tensed. Rollins turned again, just slightly, just enough for Dante to see the smirk like a man who'd already won, like someone enjoying the encore of a show no one else realized had ended. Dante leaned back. He had learned to see before acting, learned that power often lived in stillness, that noise was a privilege of the innocent. He didn't need to interrupt the trial would interrupt itself. It always did. The truth had edges, and those edges cut deepest when pressed slowly. For now, he sat. For now, he watched. Not because he had no fight left, but because he was choosing where to aim it. He sat like stone, unmoved, but the storm inside him had already begun to turn. The screen flickered to life at the front of the courtroom, the dull whir of the projector slicing through the stale air like a scalpel. The lights dimmed without announcement, and for a moment there was only breath, the kind of breath people hold when the dead are about to speak. Then the image appeared, a still frame, frozen in clinical brightness, drained of all the sound it once carried. His son, Marcus Elijah Graves, stared out from the screen, not with peace, not with rest, but with startled, unfinished agony. Sweat streaked his brow, still glistening under the blue tint of police dashcam light. His mouth was open slightly, as if caught mid-sentence, or perhaps mid-prayer. His eyes, Dante could never forget those eyes, were wide, glassy, unclosed. Not a single hand had come to shut them after the final blow. The room responded the only way it could. It didn't breathe. The silence was a clenched fist around every throat. Dante didn't move, not even as the image wavered with the light's hum. His hands rested on his thighs, but the right index finger trembled just once, involuntarily, a ripple breaking the surface of control. It wasn't weakness, it was voltage. Every nerve in his body was remembering what had been taken from him. A low cough broke the silence. Insincere, staged, meant to mock the solemnity. Brent Rollins tilted his head, shifted in his chair, and turned away from the screen. Not in shame, not in discomfort, but with a casual, theatrical yawn. His jaw cracked slightly as he stretched his arms behind his head and muttered, "Same damn photo they showed last time." His lawyer didn't flinch. The man knew better than to tell his client when to shut up. Rollins lived for spectacle, and today his favorite trick was boredom. The prosecution clicked to the next slide, but something was wrong. The angle, the frame, it was too tight, cropped awkwardly at the boy's cheek. The smear of blood that had once marred his face, gone, sanitized, reframed. The court saw a frightened teenager in the moment before tragedy, but not the cruelty that made it a tragedy. Dante's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that frame. He knew what was missing. He reached into the side pocket of his case, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a photograph of his own. An 8x10 printed in matte, edges frayed from too many times being held, studied, and memorized. He stood, but not for drama. He walked to the prosecution table without asking for permission. The lead prosecutor turned, startled, unsure whether to intercept him or step aside. Dante didn't wait for judgment. He laid the photo flat on the table. No flourish, no theatrics, just the truth, undeniable and unclean. The same image is on the screen, but uncut. The blood on Marcus's cheek glistened under the flat, the cut above his temple, the streak along the side of the car door behind his head, a stain of violence not yet washed away by bureaucracy. The prosecutor glanced at the photo, then at the screen. The version submitted was edited for clarity, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. From the gallery, a quiet scoff. One of the uniformed officers leaned toward his colleague, whispered too loudly, "Why's he always got to make it so dramatic?" Dante didn't turn. His voice came low, almost intimate, but razor-sharp. "Because you've never had to bury your son with half his skull caved in." The words didn't echo. They landed heavy like a hammer wrapped in velvet. The officer looked away, muttered something unintelligible, and suddenly became more interested in his notepad. Across the aisle, Rollins chuckled under his breath. "Always the poet," he said, folding his arms like he was settling in for a movie. "Guy should have stayed overseas. He was more useful dodging bullets than whining about dead kids." Dante returned to his seat slowly, eyes forward, not giving Rollins the courtesy of acknowledgement, but his right hand, now resting again on his thigh, held a faint smear of red. He looked down. A droplet of dried blood, his son's, had flaked from the photo and adhered to his fingertip. He rubbed it between thumb and forefinger like a sacred oil, then wiped it on the inside of his cuff. Not hidden, not cleaned, just placed. The evidence of loss should never be scrubbed into politeness. The judge called for a brief recess to verify evidentiary submissions. Court personnel bustled about, voices low, almost embarrassed by the rawness that had just unfolded. As if truth were impolite. As if blood made people uncomfortable only when it couldn't be denied. Dante stayed seated, still as ever, but something had shifted. A journalist in the third row scribbled notes, eyes darting from Dante to the photo still lying on the prosecution table. She underlined a phrase in her notebook. Deliberate silence, more violent than sound. A line she'd use later. Maybe for a headline, maybe for a story, but even she felt the weight. This wasn't courtroom theater. This was a war memorial where the body had never been given full right. Rollins crossed one leg over the other, casually picking lint off his pants. "How many more pictures are we gonna see?" he asked, tone exaggerated, drawl stretched thin. "He got a whole scrapbook back there?" His voice was designed to cut, but it lacked bite. It landed limp, because somewhere inside, even Rollins could feel it. The ground beneath him no longer solid. The court wasn't laughing with him. It wasn't laughing at all. The screen went dark. The lights returned, harsh and sterile. The judge returned to the bench. A clerk approached Dante, holding the photo gently between gloved hands as if afraid of its weight. "Would you like this returned?" she asked. Dante took it wordlessly, slid it back into the case, and sealed the zipper with the same reverence he'd once used folding Marcus's baby clothes. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not ask for rage. He asked only for the truth. And the truth, in that image, screamed louder than any protest, any punch, any verdict. Back in his seat, Rollins leaned toward his lawyer again, voice hushed but not enough. "You think anyone gives a damn about that kid? Look at the jury. They're bored. Give it another hour, they'll be checking baseball scores. But the jury wasn't bored, not anymore. They weren't looking at Rollins. They were looking at Dante, at the man who hadn't cried, hadn't yelled, hadn't raised his voice even once, and still managed to make the air feel like it was made of knives. The judge glanced down at her docket. "We'll proceed with the next exhibit," she said, monotone, professional, clinical, but her fingers tapped a little too hard against the gavel base. Something in her voice cracked imperceptibly, like the first fault line in a dam. No one asked Dante how he felt. No one dared. His grief was not public property. It didn't wear hashtags or slogans. It wore one face, the boy on the screen, whose eyes had never closed. The photo was gone from the screen, but it hadn't left the room. It lingered in the walls, in the hum of fluorescent lights, in the air clinging to the ceiling tiles like breath held too long. Even as the projector powered down and the court resumed its rehearsed pace, something beneath the surface had shifted. The silence had grown teeth. The defense stood. Not Rollins, who remained seated, chewing the inside of his cheek with the casual arrogance of a man who believed punishment belonged only to the poor and the loud, but his attorney, a middle-aged white man with a voice so dry it crackled. He adjusted his cuffs like they were credentials, straightened his spine like a page number, and began to speak in tones carefully designed to anesthetize. "The events of the incident, he said, each syllable clipped and sanitized, must be contextualized within the established protocol. The officer, my client, responded to what was perceived as a threat during a moment of elevated tension. The situation was rapidly evolving, and the individual in question displayed behavior consistent with resistance and a lack of cooperation. There it was, the symphony of system speak. No blood, no boy, nobody. Just the individual, just perceived threat, just rapid escalation. Language as a weapon, sharpened by decades of practice and printed in cold, serifed font. The attorney continued, reciting phrases like commandments, non-compliance, failure to exit vehicle, miscommunication between subject and law enforcement. He paced the floor in slow, deliberate strides, as though the cadence of his movement could somehow erase the shape of Marcus's skull after the final blow. Dante said nothing for a long while. His gaze remained downcast, eyes locked on a single sheet of paper in his lap. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't even official anymore. The edges were curled and soft, fingerprints ghosted along its margins. But in the center, beneath layers of correction fluid and redacted sections, lay a single line, once typed, now crossed out in thick black ink. The victim showed no visible signs of aggression. Someone, somewhere, had decided that line did not belong in the record. Dante raised his head slowly, each vertebra stacking like a tower. He waited until the attorney paused, mid-sentence, to breathe, then spoke, his voice low but undeniable. "Tell me," he asked, no heat in his tone, only the terrible precision of a man who'd measured every word before unleashing it. "How exactly does a person show cooperation while being beaten to death in a parked car?" The room stilled. The defense attorney blinked. Just once. Then, like a true practitioner of legal evasion, he smiled without his eyes. "We're not here to speculate on hypotheticals, Mr. Graves." Dante's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something colder. "That was no hypothetical," he replied. "That was my son." Rollins shifted in his seat, tilting slightly toward his lawyer and muttering under his breath, but the mic caught it anyway. "He still thinks ink on paper can wash blood off my hands." Then he looked back at Dante, voice rising just enough to cut. "You think that blacked-out line matters? You think the truth is what they print?" He didn't laugh, but the smirk played at the corners of his mouth like rot returning to the surface. Rollins had never needed to shout. His poison worked in whispers. Dante leaned forward, pulled the paper from his lap, and held it up for the court to see. "This is the original incident report," he said, voice flat, unembellished. "The one written the night Marcus died. It says he didn't resist. It says there were no signs of violence until the officer approached. He tapped the redacted line with a single finger. And this is what was removed. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. But the weight of his words bent the atmosphere like gravity. The judge asked for the document to be submitted as evidence. The bailiff approached, with latex gloves and a plastic folder, handling the paper like a crime scene relic. Rawlins didn't flinch. He had seen this show before. He knew how the system worked. He had helped build it. Dante sat back down, but not in defeat. He moved like a man who'd just driven a blade clean into the table and left it standing. The defense resumed with surgical detachment. There's a difference between protocol and outcome, the lawyer said. The officer made a judgment call based on the information he had at the time. The tragedy is regrettable, but stop, Dante said. The word wasn't loud, but it stopped the sentence like a wall. Stop calling it a tragedy. Tragedy is when a bridge collapses. Tragedy is when lightning hits a playground. What happened to my son had nothing to do with fate. It was a decision, a sequence of choices. One man, one badge, one fist. Rawlins scoffed audibly now, tossing his head back. And here we go again, he said. The Holy Father routine. Dante didn't look at him. He addressed the judge, the jury, and something higher. My son's name wasn't even on the first report, he said. They called him the subject, like he wasn't flesh, wasn't someone's firstborn, someone's basketball teammate, someone's favorite science fair partner. He paused, then added, they gave more description to the car than the boy inside it. A murmur stirred in the gallery, but the judge rapped her gavel once. Silence returned. The defense lawyer tried to recover, flipping through a thick binder, holding it like a shield. Let's return to the procedural review of officer conduct under Title. No, Dante said. Again, not loud, but undeniable. He opened another file, thin, worn, yellowed at the corners. This is a photocopy of the first draft, the unedited one, the one before it passed through 6 departments, 3 compliance officers, and a PR team. He flipped it around, held it high, showing the jury a sentence underlined in red. Use of force, unnecessary based on body cam footage. And this, he said, voice sharpening to a blade, is the part that didn't make it into your evolving situation narrative. Rawlins laughed this time, a short, hard bark. You think waving paper makes you powerful? He asked. You think anybody in this room cares what the first version said? All they'll remember is the verdict. That's all that matters. You're not building justice. You're writing fiction. But Dante's silence in reply was louder than any retort. He gathered his pages calmly, tapped them together once, and slid them back into his folder with a motion so precise it felt like a signature. His spine didn't bend. His hands didn't shake. His anger had never been rage. It was refined, tempered, weaponized. The court recessed again, this time for lunch. But no one moved quickly. No one laughed or checked their phones. The words had done what fists never could. They had unmasked something in the air, not the brutality, but the bureaucracy that made brutality possible. The ink, the edits, the file folders that rewrote the dead into policy failures. As Dante stood to leave, he passed by Rawlins's table. He didn't stop, he didn't look, but Rawlins, ever the showman, leaned forward just enough to whisper, "They'll never remember your son's name." Dante stopped then, just a second, then turned his head, not enough to face him, but enough that Rawlins saw the profile, the cheek, the jaw, the eyes that had once stared down armed men in the hills of Helmand, never blinked. Dante said one thing, "They will." The weight of the courtroom had thickened, words still hovering like smoke in the aftermath of Dante's final reply. They will. 3 syllables that didn't scream, but detonated silently behind every chest in the room. And maybe it was that silence, unyielding, undeniable, that unsettled Rawlins most, because some men weren't built to lose attention, and Brent Rawlins, for all his medals and venom, had never learned how to sit still in the shadow of another man's dignity. Dante turned away, already halfway to the hallway exit when he heard it, the heavy scrape of leather shoes on the polished floor. Quick, too quick to be procedural. He pivoted only slightly, not out of fear but reflex. Military instinct twitching at the edge of memory, and there he was. Rollins, closing distance with the smooth, coiled swagger of someone who wanted violence more than justice. He didn't shout, he didn't raise alarms, he just let the words slide out of his mouth, like poison seeping into a vein. Out there, Rollins sneered, his voice low and twisted like rusted wire. You were a soldier. A fighter, a killer maybe, but in here, he stopped inches from Dante, breath thick with contempt, eyes glowing with something that wasn't hate, but possession. In here, you're just a failed father, and your boy, he died screaming, didn't he? The punch landed a fraction of a second later. No warning, no build-up, no flinch. A straight, brutal hook aimed with precision and pleasure. His knuckles crashed into Dante's jaw with a crack that cut through the silence like a rifle report. Blood burst from the corner of Dante's mouth, painting the floor in dark arterial punctuation. The courtroom gasped. Not in protest, not in defense, but in stunned inertia. No one moved. No bailiff intervened. No guard reacted. Every witness, every lawyer, every official figure of authority froze, rooted in the paralyzing theater of sanctioned brutality. Dante stumbled a half-step back. Just one. His heel dragged across the floor like a knife carving presence into marble. He bent at the waist slightly, blood pooling against his tongue, and stayed there, not collapsed, not broken, just still. Rollins straightened with the posture of a boxer finishing a perfect round. He rolled his shoulders. He smiled, like he had just reminded the world who owned the space between bodies. Flash, a soundless whisper of a camera shutter sliced the air. A young journalist near the gallery's edge had lifted her phone at the exact moment Dante looked up. One eye narrowed from the hit, cheekbone beginning to swell, and yet it wasn't pain in his gaze. It wasn't even anger. It was cold, a chilling, surgical coldness, the kind of still that came before bombs. His stare locked onto Rollins with the full weight of all the graves he had ever stood beside. It didn't promise vengeance. It didn't even promise survival. It promised extinction. Rollins faltered, if only for a second. His grin twitched, unsure of itself. The theater had changed. He had drawn blood. He had landed the hit, but something was wrong. The crowd wasn't clapping. The system didn't cheer. And Dante? Dante hadn't said a word. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't threatened. He hadn't even touched him, but the look in those eyes, it carried the weight of 10,000 war ghosts whispering in unison. The judge's gavel came down 3 times in rapid succession, not to restore order, but to remember how. "Mr. Rollins!" she shouted, voice cracking at the edge of disbelief. "This court is not a battlefield. You are in contempt. I'm in control." Rollins snapped, not to her, but to himself, louder than needed, louder than smart. He came in here looking like he runs the room. Someone had to remind him where he stands. Dante straightened. The blood was still on his lip, now drying in a thin copper line. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't respond to Rollins. Instead, he turned to the judge, eyes level. "Permission to remain seated?" he said quietly. The judge nodded, stunned. Dante lowered himself into the nearest chair with the grace of a stone being returned to its pedestal. His hands were folded. His chest barely rose. But that silence, his silence, had begun to consume the room. Behind him, someone whispered, "Why didn't anyone stop it?" No one answered. Rollins paced in a tight circle now, suddenly less sure of his momentum. His fists flexed and unflexed. He wasn't used to being the loudest thing in a quiet room. He thrived on noise, on chaos. And yet, in that moment, the silence was not Dante's weakness, it was his dominion. Every inch of it was owned by the man who had just taken a punch and stayed. Flash again. The photo snapped by the journalist had already traveled. A caption had been typed with trembling fingers. He didn't fall, he rose. It would go viral in 23 minutes. The blood on the floor was not cleaned. It pooled quietly under the table leg, and from somewhere in the jury box, a woman in her 50s who hadn't blinked since the punch was thrown whispered, "That man didn't need to fight back. The fight left him the moment he looked up." Dante reached into his bag without urgency and pulled out a single folded tissue. He pressed it once to his split lip, then set it down beside him on the bench. No performance, no martyrdom, just presence. Unapologetic, undefeated. Rollins walked back to his seat slowly. No swagger this time, no pride. He sat down like a man returning to a game he might no longer understand. His lawyer didn't speak to him, didn't look at him, and for the first time since the trial began, Rollins glanced up toward the gallery and realized the faces had changed. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the man who took the hit and didn't blink. The silence didn't break. It held, stretched taut like a wire before it snapped, humming with the aftershock of Rollins's punch and the weight of the gaze that followed. Dante hadn't fallen. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't even touched his attacker. But something in the room had shifted, some balance undone. Rollins sat back down, smug for a moment, shoulders rolling with the dumb confidence of a predator who thought the kill was clean. But Dante didn't stay seated. He rose, not like a man provoked, not like a father avenging, but like something older, colder, more exact, his spine aligned with military geometry. One breath, one step. He moved with no warning, no shout, no fury. The courtroom barely registered it before it happened. From the ground, his body uncoiled and rotated on his hip, smooth as oil on steel. The kick came not from emotion, but from training, from memory, from war. It started at the core, traveled through the thigh, and exploded through the shin. Rollins never saw it. The heel landed square across his sternum with a sickening thud, collapsing air and arrogance in the same instant. His body launched backward, legs flying up, head snapping back as he slammed against the edge of the witness table. The crash echoed off the walls like thunder in a tomb. He sprawled across the floor in a heap of limbs and breathless confusion, arms flailing for something to hold that no longer existed. The courtroom didn't gasp. It inhaled and stopped. No one moved. Not a guard, not a lawyer, not even the judge. Chairs creaked, but didn't scrape. The moment turned to stone. Then someone, far back, whispered in disbelief, "That's Delta Kick. That's banned in SEAL training." The words barely reached the front, but Dante heard them. He didn't respond. He didn't acknowledge. He simply advanced. Rollins groaned on the floor, curled halfway onto his side, coughing, wheezing, eyes wide with something too unfamiliar to name. Not pain, not even fear. Recognition. Recognition that the rules of engagement had changed, that he had stepped into a space where courtroom bravado didn't matter, where his badge, his smirk, and his venom held no power. Because this man, one now standing over him, silent as a knife, was not bound by courtroom posturing. He was bound by the grave. Dante reached into his pocket with a slowness that carried more threat than speed ever could. His fingers pulled free a single item, a plastic name tag, worn, slightly bent, its edges dulled by time. He crouched, one knee to the floor, and placed it gently on Rollins's chest, directly over his heart. The small rectangular tag, white with black ink, bore a name too often misprinted, Arcasy Graves, the boy with the unclosed eyes. Dante spoke only once, and he spoke quietly, but the sound cut deeper than any gavel. "The boy had a name," he said. "Don't forget it again." He stood without a flourish, without a backward glance. He didn't adjust his shirt. He didn't wipe his mouth. He left the blood. He left the silence. He left Rollins. The tag stayed. For a moment, Rollins didn't move. His breath came in short, uneven draws, as though the wind had been knocked from his soul rather than his lungs. His fingers twitched toward the name tag, but stopped, not out of respect, out of something closer to disbelief. He had become the body on the floor, and the man who had put him there wasn't facing charges, he was facing history. From the bench, the judge leaned forward, her voice trying to return. "Mr. Graves," but Dante was already stepping back, hands raised, not in surrender, not in apology, but in certainty. He had made his move. He had drawn his line. The courtroom would decide what to do with it, but no one would mistake his silence for permission ever again. Security entered late, too late. eyes wide, hands unsure. They didn't reach for their weapons. They didn't rush him. They had seen what happened. More importantly, they had seen how fast it happened. One move, one strike, no hesitation, no excessive force. A response, not an assault, measured, exact, unmistakably trained, and that terrified them more than rage ever could. Behind them, a reporter lowered her phone with trembling hands. "He didn't even blink," she murmured. It wasn't violence, it was the verdict. The room began to move again, slowly, as if time itself had to catch its breath. The judge called for a recess. Bailiffs swept in, still hesitant, unsure whether to restrain, to question, or to simply stay out of the blast radius. Rollins was being helped to his feet, stumbling, one eye already swelling shut, teeth bloodied. He pointed at Dante weakly. He assaulted me," he slurred, but no one reacted. The courtroom wasn't listening to Rollins anymore. They had seen the punch. They had seen the reaction. And what Dante delivered was not vengeance, it was the consequence. Dante turned, walked toward his seat again, and sat with the quiet dignity of a man who had returned fire not to kill, but to warn. His hands were folded in front of him. His chest rose and fell with calm. But in his eyes, burning steady, unshaken, there was a message no judge could redact. The war wasn't over, but this battlefield now belonged to him. The courtroom hadn't yet recovered from the silence when the doors slammed open like thunder breaking bone. 3 officers in tactical gray rushed through with hands twitching near holsters, boots striking the tile with the rhythm of alarm. They didn't call his name. They didn't ask questions. They came as muscle, not law. One pointed at Dante, eyes wide with panic, masquerading as duty. The other 2 flanked him, moving fast, trying to encircle him like wolves taught to contain something bigger than they could understand. Dante stood slowly. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't move to attack. He simply turned to face them with the quiet focus of a man who had counted every inch of the room and didn't need a second look. His stance shifted, just slightly, barely more than a breath, but to anyone who had ever seen combat, it was unmistakable. The weight is distributed evenly. Knees soft, not bent. Shoulders lowered, not hunched. Not aggression. Readiness. The first officer lunged, arm outstretched, in a clumsy attempt to grab and dominate. The moment his wrist crossed Dante's line of vision, the counter came like a reflex fired through memory. A twist. A pivot, one smooth redirection of force. The officer's momentum turned against him in a blur of leverage and balance. He hit the ground flat on his back, hand instinctively reaching for a weapon he would never touch. The second moved next, coming in from behind, trying to wrap him up. A chokehold, sloppy, desperate. Dante dipped his shoulder, rotated out, and caught the man's forearm mid-air. The torque was clean. A spiral that brought the elbow joint to the edge of fracture, held just shy of the snap. A knee drove into the officer's gut, buckling his core, before he was swept off his feet and deposited onto the marble floor with a sound more final than pain. The third officer hesitated, and that hesitation cost him everything. He reached for his sidearm. He never got there. Dante was already moving. 3 steps. Tight, controlled. He didn't punch, he deflected, redirected, and advanced. One hand struck the wrist away, the other locked onto the man's shoulder. He spun him, dropped low, and used the man's center of gravity to vault him onto the edge of the judge's bench. The weapon never cleared leather. The threat never became real. 3 officers, 3 bodies on the ground. Not dead, not broken, just out. The crowd did not cheer. The judge did not shout. Even the journalists forgot to write, because what they had just witnessed wasn't a brawl. It wasn't a theater. It was something colder, sharper, a demonstration, like a blade pulled from velvet, fast, precise, terrifying in how little noise it made. One of the officers lay clutching his ribs, eyes glazed with disbelief. "We're fighting a damn machine," he whispered. Dante turned, breathing steadily, voice low and deadly calm. He knelt beside him just for a second, his knee pressing lightly against the man's chest. Not to hurt, but to remind. "If I wanted to die," he said, "I'd have done it in Kandahar." The officer didn't reply. He wouldn't forget. Across the floor, Rollins had been trying to crawl toward the back exit. elbows slick with his blood, lips split open and trembling not from pain but from something worse, humiliation. His voice cracked as he screamed toward the remaining guards, "Be bastards, gone rogue, shoot him, shoot him!" But no one pulled a gun, because they knew, they saw it. Dante had every opportunity to kill, he didn't. Not one strike went too far, not one move was reckless. His control was surgical, terrifying, complete. He wasn't a man lashing out. He was a man reminding the room that he could end every one of them if he wanted to, and he didn't. That was the part no one could explain. That was the part that left even the judge staring, with her gavel still clutched mid-air. Dante looked up from the floor. His eyes found Rawlins crawling in circles, leaving red streaks behind him like a wounded animal that had mistaken the courtroom for a cage he could still control. Dante took a step forward. Rawlins froze. Not a sound. Then another step. Rawlins's mouth opened, but no words came. And that silence again returned to Dante, not as armor, not as weapon, but as judgment. The room watched him reclaim the space, not with fists, but with presence. He stood among the fallen, unscathed, unapologetic, unstoppable. He stood among the fallen, silent as the room rebuilt its breath, and in that stillness, something else, something untouchable, began to move. It didn't come from the courtroom. It didn't wait for verdicts or gavel strikes. It came from everywhere else, from fingers on glass, from screens that never blink, from the swarm of watchers who hadn't seen justice in years, and suddenly couldn't look away. At 2:43 p.m., the first clip went live. 38 seconds, vertical frame, shaky at the edges but clear enough to see it all. The punch Rawlins threw, the silence that followed, the strike Dante delivered. Clean, mechanical, and unstoppable. And the aftermath, more powerful than the violence, Dante standing over Rawlins. Quiet, controlled, the name tag of Marcus pressed flat against a blood-stained chest. No filter, no edit, no apology. By 2:57 p.m., the hashtag #YouHitASeal was trending number 4 in the country. By 3:09, it hit number 1. The video looped across every platform. TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram. Stitch after stitch. Zoom-ins. Freeze frames. The moment Rawlins fell. Played backward and forward with subtitles. Not rage. Precision. This wasn't a brawl. This was a message. Dante Graves didn't snap, he decided. The internet moved like fire, hot, indiscriminate, and exact in its hunger. But this time, it wasn't chasing blood, it was chasing the truth. One account posted the clip in slow motion, tagging it simply, "That's not a punch, that's the system getting audited." It got 1.2 million likes in under an hour. Then came the name, Victor Bravo 7. No profile photo, no bio. Just a banner image of a desert horizon and a username that only meant something if you'd worn a patch and carried a rifle. He reposted the clip with 6 words. "This man saved my entire unit." The next tweet hit harder. Helmand Province, 2010. "We walked into a minefield. I froze. My CO panicked. Graves didn't. He carried 3 of us out, bleeding. Didn't even file the report with his name on it. He said, 'It's not heroism, it's protocol.'" That post didn't just go viral, it detonated. Suddenly, Dante wasn't just a father. He wasn't just the face of grief in a courtroom soaked with silence. He was a soldier, a ghost from wars that most people had already scrawled past. The internet didn't see a man who fought. It saw a man who had already fought. Over there, for a country that refused to fight for him back home. Another comment floated up from a user with the handle @BackyardDad81. He didn't flinch when Rawlins hit him. You know why? Because flinching is something you unlearn when you've heard mortars fall 6 feet from your kid's bunk. Pinned, shared, echoed in every corner of every feed. By 4:15 p.m., CNN was running the headline, "Veteran SEAL subdues officers in courtroom after assault. Was it self-defense or something more?" The segment replayed the footage side by side with the freeze frame of Dante standing above Rawlins. One anchor tried to play neutral, the other didn't. "I watched the full clip," she said. "I didn't see an outburst. I saw restraint. I saw control. If that man wanted to kill someone, He'd have done it before the bailiff got the door open. But Dante said nothing. He didn't post. He didn't appear. He didn't explain. He simply vanished from the press, retreated into that same silence that had unnerved the courtroom. That quiet didn't read as absence. It read as choice. And the internet knew. It had seen enough false apologies, staged statements, celebrity notes app confessions. Dante didn't owe the world a quote. He had delivered the truth and walked away from the microphone. Someone posted a split image. Left side, the courtroom clip. Right side, a grainy photo of Dante in full tactical gear, holding a wounded soldier over one shoulder while waving a squad forward with the other. The caption, "Same man, different war." A veteran subreddit pinned the video at the top with a comment that read, "We don't endorse violence, but if someone hits a seal in a courtroom, they better hope paperwork's not the only thing they're trained to punch." Thousands of upvotes, thousands of retweets. Not because people loved violence, but because, for once, it wasn't random. It was a consequence delivered with the kind of calm no protest could fake. Then came the avalanche. Activist pages, law enforcement watchdog groups, military forums, fathers, mothers, teachers, veterans, journalists. The narrative wasn't split. It didn't fracture into tribes like it so often did. It built. It stacked. It accelerated. You had a seal became more than a moment. It became a line in the sand. One tweet read, "They called him a threat. He was a mirror." Another, "He didn't shout. He didn't riot. He just showed them what training looks like when justice fails." By 6:22 p.m., Rawlins's name had been searched more than any sitting senator. His Wikipedia page was locked for vandalism. A tweet calling him a sociopathic coward hiding behind a badge had over 400,000 likes. Someone found footage from his old commendation ceremony and spliced it next to the courtroom footage. No words, just faces. Then and now. A loop of power misused and power met with precision. And still, Dante remained silent. Not because he was hiding, but because his words had already landed. In bone, in blood, in bandwidth, and now in history. One user summed it up best in a post that would later be quoted by every outlet from MSNBC to The Atlantic. He didn't want to go viral. He wanted to go home. They brought him into court like a defendant, but what they got was a reminder. Some men aren't built for silence. They're built to show you what silence becomes when pushed. The world roared. But Dante remained still. While hashtags climbed and headlines flared, he stepped into a quieter war, one fought in pages, margins, and stains. The courtroom had shown the surface. Now it was time to peel it back. And when the system tried to bury something, it used paper, not shovels. He didn't go in alone. The man beside him wore an old bomber jacket faded at the collar, his gait uneven from a hip shattered in Ramadi. His name was Colton Mearse, ex-JAG, former Army Ranger turned attorney, and the kind of man who understood that some wars didn't need rifles. His law license had dust on it, but his eyes were sharp. "You asked for the truth," he said. "I'm here to help you dig it out of the rot." They started with the box. A plain file crate, battered, its sides scarred with shipping stickers, court labels, and dried tape. It looked unremarkable. Inside was anything but. Rawlins's name wasn't on the front. It was buried under initials, under codes, under department stamps designed to scatter accountability like ash in the wind. Mears reached in first, pulled out the folders one by one, some crisp, most bent, some smeared with what looked like coffee but felt more like contempt. 16 complaints. The first had been filed by a mother whose son came home with a black eye and a broken wrist. No charges, no apology, just a warning letter she never got to read. The second was an anonymous internal memo, typed, unsigned, concern regarding Officer Rawlins' aggression during routine traffic stops. The third had a red pen slashed through it, the word handled written diagonally across the page like a scar. Dante sat at the table without speaking, flipping through the pages as if they were pieces of a body exhumed. Fourth file, fifth, then the sixth, this one thicker, stapled clumsily, with a blurry black and white photo clipped to the top. A boy, 15, lying on the hood of a car, face swollen. The officer's report claimed resisted search. The hospital report claimed possible head trauma, unconscious on arrival. No follow-up, no investigation, case closed within 48 hours. Mears slid the 7th file across the table. This one's sealed in most systems. Had to call a favor. It was a death report. The man in his 20s stopped for loitering. Later found dead in a holding cell. The cause of death is listed as fall from own height. The footage? Corrupted. The arresting officer? Rollins. No internal review, no suspension. Just a commendation 2 weeks later for exemplary community engagement. Dante turned the page. There was a photo attached. The dead man's mouth is slightly open, eyes half-lidded, and neck bruised. Someone had tried to crop the photo, but a corner of another officer's boot was still visible in the shot. Just enough. He didn't blink. He picked up a red pen, underlined a single sentence in the report. No further inquiry warranted. Mears lit a cigarette without asking. This is rot, he said. This isn't one cop. This is an ecosystem that feeds on silence. Then they kept going. 4 more files. 8, each one more grotesque in its subtlety. None of them as loud. None of them was scandalous enough to spark action. But all of them told the same story. Abuse disguised as discipline. Prejudice masked as protocol. Power stretched just far enough not to snap. Until Marcus. At the bottom of the box lay a manila envelope, unmarked, unopened. Mears opened it carefully. Inside was a printed email chain. 2 lieutenants discussing community perception. One entry highlighted in yellow. Rollins is effective in reducing crime rates in high-risk zones. Dante tilted his head. Define high risk. Mears sighed. Black neighborhoods. And there it was. Rollins had been rewarded. Promoted, cited in internal briefings as a model for preemptive intervention strategy. In plain words, he arrested fast, hit hard, and filed just enough paperwork to make it all look clean. His precinct showed a decrease in violent crime, but right beneath it, unspoken and ugly. A spike in juvenile detentions. Minor infractions ballooned into criminal charges. Kids with truancy tickets were held overnight for attitude. When they left, they didn't come back the same. Dante flipped the final report, and something fell out. A note, handwritten, folded 4 times. He opened it slowly. Inside, a line from a body cam operator's log, never filed. Rollins said, "That little monkey doesn't know who's got their boot on his neck." The ink had smeared, like it had been written in a shaking hand. Dante didn't speak. He folded the note and slid it back into the file. His hands were steady, his jaw set. Mears looked at him. "You ready to go public?" "No," Dante said. "I'm ready to make it impossible for them to pretend it didn't happen." They spent the next 6 hours organizing, printing, scanning, and collating. Not building a case, building a mirror. One they would hold up to the system, one it could not turn away from. Every redacted line was uncensored. Every euphemism translated. Every soft phrase rewritten in the language of harm. Use of force justified became unarmed teen punched in the face. Subject non-compliant became didn't respond fast enough. Officer behavior under review became he's still on payroll. Dante didn't draft a statement. He didn't write a speech. He put all the files into a binder. On the front, he wrote one sentence. "This is what justice looks like before the cameras arrive." He slid the last folder into the binder, closed it with a quiet finality, and left without a word. The documents, the ink, the buried sins. They were all behind him now, stacked and waiting like charges before detonation. But before justice could be served in the daylight, there was one final darkness to walk through. No camera, no jury, just him and the man who'd tried to bury his son under protocol. The room was windowless. The walls were concrete, no clock, no seal of justice, only a single table, 2 chairs, and a ceiling light that buzzed with fluorescent decay. Interrogation rooms didn't believe in comfort. They believed in exposure. And this one wasn't designed for dignity. It was designed for stripping men down to their bones. Rollins was already there. He sat slouched, cuffs loose around his wrists. breath short, one eye still bruised from the courtroom, but his smirk hadn't healed. It sat crooked across his face like it refused to die. When Dante entered, Rollins didn't stand, didn't shift. He just leaned back further, like the room owed him posture. Dante said nothing. He moved to the other chair and sat, slow, deliberate. His spine was straight, hands folded, chin raised slightly, just enough to make the space around him feel smaller. He didn't glance at Rollins, didn't speak, just looked past him, through him. Like waiting was a kind of discipline Rollins would never master. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Still nothing. Rollins broke first. Silent treatment now, he said, voice thin and forced casual. Gonna meditate me into a confession? He chuckled dryly. Or you just waiting for someone to whisper in your ear what to say next? Dante didn't flinch. His eyes never left the spot on the wall behind Rollins' head. He breathed, like time moved slower in his chest. Rollins leaned forward. You know what this is, right? They're just giving you a room with me because they think you earned it, because the internet crowned you a saint with combat boots. But this, he gestured around, this doesn't mean anything. Dante finally looked at him, just looked, and a smirk faltered. Rollins cleared his throat. You think they'll do anything to me? You think the system wants to dig itself open just to satisfy your grief? Dante's voice came, low and steady. Did you see his eyes? Rollins blinked. What? Dante didn't repeat himself. He just leaned forward, elbows resting on the edge of the metal table, voice still calm. When you hit him, when you pulled him out of that car, when you dropped him like he was nothing, did you look him in the eye? Rollins snorted. Jesus Christ. I did, Dante said, louder now, words clear enough to bite. I saw them after, wide open, still wet, still waiting for someone to tell him it was going to be okay. Rollins rolled his eyes, but something flickered beneath, something twitching behind the sneer. Dante stood slowly. No threat, just gravity. He stepped around the table, not fast, not looming, just present in a way that stripped the oxygen from the room. Rollins shifted in his seat, not out of fear, but out of habit, like something in him remembered what happened the last time they stood this close. Dante looked down at him. I see those eyes every time I blink, he said. They don't ask for revenge. They don't ask for peace. They just ask why. And I don't have an answer, because the only one who does, he paused, breathing once, is too much of a coward to even admit he looked. Rollins barked a laugh. Hollow, shallow. You think this makes you righteous? No, Dante said. It makes me dangerous. The silence returned, but this time it belonged to Dante. He didn't swing. He didn't shout. He turned, walked to the door, and knocked once. A guard opened it. He paused just long enough to deliver the last word, without turning around. I saw his eyes, and I'll never forget them. That's the difference between us. He walked out, leaving Rollins alone under the buzzing light, staring not at Dante, but at the space where Dante used to be. And for the first time, there was no line left to cross, only consequences. He left the room with the same silence he carried in. Rollins stayed behind, alone, with nothing but white walls and an overhead bulb that flickered once, then gave up. Dante didn't wait for more confrontation. He didn't give the press another headline or the court another scene. He had already done what he came to do, draw the line between who he used to be and what the system had made him become. But the story wasn't done with him. It was moving elsewhere now, into the marble corridors of power, where comfort and denial had long buried consequence, until now. The hearing was scheduled with urgency masked as formality. A congressional subcommittee, hastily assembled under the pretense of oversight, but really out of fear. The footage was everywhere. The name Marcus Elijah Graves trended longer than most politicians could tolerate, and the binder Dante left behind, black cover, bloodless pages, redacted lies peeled back to raw ink, had been entered into the record. But no one expected what came next. Dante did not attend. There was no arrival, no camera flash, no righteous father at the podium gripping the sides like a pulpit. What he sent instead was a file, encrypted, time-stamped, labeled in one line of block text, Night of Incident. Original source, unedited. They opened it mid-section, expecting body cam grain, maybe low audio, maybe chaos. They didn't expect a boy, alone, scared, alive. The screen filled with the glow of the streetlights as seen through a windshield. Rain smeared against the glass in soft arcs. A shaky voice, young and calm, whispered, "I'm not doing anything wrong." The camera shifted. A beam of flashlight, the outline of a badge, out of the car. Nah. The boy's voice again, firmer this time. "I didn't do anything." Static, movement. Then it happened. The door yanked open. Hands reaching, the camera dipped and jostled. The boy, Marcus, shouting, not screaming, "I didn't do anything wrong." The last clear image was his face, turned back toward the camera, eyes wide, mouth trembling, but not crying. And then, impact. Steel. Bone. The audio picked up a dull, wet thud and silence. The video froze on the final frame, Marcus's cheek against the side of the car, eyes still open. The screen stayed lit, no fade-out, no music, just the quiet buzz of fluorescent light in a congressional chamber that had never held its breath like this before. No one moved, no one dared. Then the chairwoman, a woman in her 60s, sharp blazer, decades of neutrality written into the lines on her face, asked the question. She didn't shout. She didn't weep, but her voice cracked once, just enough for the room to lean in. "Who," she said, "authorized that child to be buried before anyone stood up and said it was wrong?" The silence that followed was not symbolic. It was an indictment, because no one had an answer. Not the chief of police seated beside her, not the oversight director 3 seats down, not the Department of Justice representative scrolling through his tablet like it could shield him. No one had an answer, because the answer was this: everyone did nothing. Dante's voice wasn't on the tape, his face wasn't in the chamber, but his presence was louder than any testimony. He hadn't come to plead for justice. He had come to leave the truth on their desk and walk away. And the truth had teeth. A junior representative tried to pivot. "We can't let one isolated—" The chairwoman cut him off. "That boy said he didn't do anything wrong, and we let them bury him without proving he was right. The file was entered into the record, timestamp and all. It wasn't played again. It didn't need to be, because Marcus Elijah Graves had just spoken in the chamber louder than any lobbyist, louder than any parent, louder than any flag ever draped over an apology, and for the first time, Congress had nothing left to say. The silence from Congress didn't fade. It spread, like ink on parchment, like grief in the bones, like truth through systems that weren't built to carry its weight. After the video, no official spoke for 24 hours. Statements were drafted and deleted, talking points reviewed, shredded, reworded. But nothing could reshape the still frame of Marcus Elijah Graves with his cheek pressed to steel and his eyes wide open. And so, when the state-level committee summoned Dante to appear before their chamber, they didn't do it to challenge him. They did it because they could no longer ignore the shape his silence had carved into the public record. He arrived at 9:03 a.m. He didn't come in a suit. He didn't come dressed for television. He came in his uniform, worn, sun-faded, and unpolished. Sealed dress, not parade perfect, but lived in. On his left chest, the bronze star, dulled by time, untouched by shine. On the right, a square of torn fabric, frayed at the edges, stitched into the seam by hand. The color used to be sky blue. Now it was dulled by dirt, soil, and grief. It had once belonged to his son's shirt, the one Marcus had worn the day he was buried. The room didn't stand when Dante entered. It fell silent, not from awe, but from weight. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply walked to the podium and stood, feet planted, shoulders even, arms at his sides. He did not grip the mic. He did not shuffle his notes. He just stood there, uniform, hanging off his frame like a flag too heavy to fly. The chair recognized him. "Mr. Graves, we invited you here to speak." Dante didn't look at them. His eyes stayed forward, past the audience, past the lights, fixed on the lens of the live stream camera. He wasn't speaking to the room, he was speaking to the country, to history, to the part of the system that always watched, but never saw. One representative, middle-aged, crisp-collared, voice too polished to be spontaneous, leaned into his mic and asked, "Mr. Graves, what is it you've come here to demand?" Dante blinked once. His reply came steady, soft, and ironclad. "I didn't come to demand," he said. "I came to remind." The words hit like a hammer, wrapped in velvet. The room didn't murmur. It didn't react. It absorbed the line like skin absorbs a scar. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. From the back row, a figure stood. A man in army fatigues, chest full of ribbons, face worn by desert heat and time. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He simply stood at attention, back straight, eyes locked on Dante. A former soldier recognized the command, one uniform answering another, one truth acknowledging the one that came before. Dante didn't turn to him. He didn't break posture. But the corner of his mouth, just barely, twitched. In a hospital 3 counties away, Rollins sat upright in bed, his face drawn tight from half-healed bruises and fresh fear. He watched the live stream through a government-issued tablet. When Dante entered the frame, he clenched the edge of his mattress hard enough to tear the skin at the base of his fingers. Blood pooled under his nails. The nurse tried to mute the volume. Rollins didn't let her. He watched every second. Watched as the man he'd tried to break stood silent in front of the state without once raising his voice. Watched as Dante Graves weaponized stillness into a reckoning. And when the camera zoomed slightly, just slightly to capture the fabric stitched above his heart, Rollins exhaled like something inside him had been kicked. Because there was no badge there, no weapon, no rank, just a piece of a dead child's shirt, turned into a banner the system couldn't unsee. Back in the hearing room, a reporter scribbled the quote, "I came to remind." She circled it, underlined it twice, then stared at the man who'd said it, and realized he wasn't quoting grief, he was giving a command. The stillness Dante left behind at the hearing didn't dissolve, it hardened. Across state lines, across offices once safe in anonymity, the silence turned to dread, because now the badge wasn't armor, it was a spotlight. And what it illuminated wasn't honor, it was rot. The Department of Justice launched a full review, not because it wanted to, because it had no choice. The binder Dante submitted became Exhibit A, but what followed made it obsolete. Internal files, once buried beneath years of procedural insulation, surfaced like corpses after floodwater. Reports scrubbed clean by oversight. Emails forwarded to nowhere. Complaints rerouted into administrative purgatory. They didn't find smoke, they found a furnace. Rollins's name bled through the records like an infection. 16 complaints had only been the preface. There were more, dozens more, buried under Joint Task Force memos, lost in pilot program evaluations, lost in pilot programs no one used twice. His career wasn't a record of service. It was a blueprint of protection for brutality masked as policy. And then the training surfaced. An internal memo leaked from a defunct community stabilization program, once piloted in 3 districts, including Rollins. The document was dry, clinical, and sterilized by language, techniques for dominant perimeter control in high-tension minority sectors. But when investigators dug deeper, they found the training footage. It wasn't a simulation, it was a playbook. Body cam from a workshop showed Rollins instructing junior officers how to preempt resistance by overwhelming first contact. He smiled while demonstrating how to slam a suspect into the hood of a car before asking questions. He laughed when someone asked what to do if the subject turned out to be a minor. Then you file it as community stress escalation. That's the code. Behind the camera, someone laughed too. A week later, a whistleblower released audio, 7 years old, time-stamped, buried in a case that had been quietly closed without disciplinary action. The voice was unmistakably Rollins. He was recounting an incident during a night patrol. A kid, black, maybe 14, had been tackled by mistake. Wrong suspect, wrong name, wrong street. In the recording, Rollins said, "I just did it by accident. They have a lot of babies." Roughly translated, crudely meant accident. They breed like rats anyway. The words didn't echo. They carved. Across the country, the clip spread like fire across dry fields. You couldn't unhear it. You couldn't explain it away. There was no misquote, no nuance, just the sound of indifference, wearing a badge, and a laugh that felt like it came from something less than human. When Dante heard it, he didn't flinch. He was alone in a briefing room with Mears, both of them sitting across from a monitor where the audio played on loop. The air was still, thick, hot, with something no AC could fix. Mears muted the speaker. Dante looked straight ahead, his voice flat. "Every sentence that comes out of his mouth is another fingernail scraping across my son's coffin." He said nothing else. He didn't need to, because the tape did what fists and files never could. It tore the badge from Rollins's chest in the minds of millions. The image of law and order collapsed under the weight of a voice that didn't care it was being recorded. And more damning than his cruelty was how comfortable he sounded saying it. Over the next 48 hours, 5 officers who had signed off on Rollins's past promotions were named publicly. 3 resigned, 2 lawyered up. 1 internal affairs commander attempted to walk back statements praising Rollins's aggressive but effective policing strategy. But screenshots of his email praising the fear-nursed method had already gone viral. There was no walking back. The badge had stopped meaning integrity. Now, it meant infection. Back in the hospital, Rollins watched his reputation disintegrate in real time. Commentators no longer debated his actions. They dissected his voice. A face once plastered on precinct banners was now blacked out on news panels. One station aired his quote, unedited, before cutting to a panel of community leaders. No one spoke for 5 seconds. Then a pastor said, "And that's the kind of silence we bury our children in." The clip went international. From South Africa to Sweden, headlines ran with variations of the same phrase. When the uniform hides decay, who does it serve? Dante didn't smile. He didn't attend interviews. He refused all speaking requests. Instead, he walked into the next deposition with a stack of printed transcripts. Highlighted, dated, verified. He dropped them on the table in front of the review board and said, "This is what a cover-up looks like. This is what protection of a predator looks like. This is what silence buys when it's funded by fear." The room didn't argue. They read. Because now the badge wasn't shining, it was peeling, and what lay underneath was what Dante had always seen, not misconduct, but a system that had never considered Marcus's life worth the ink to defend. The day the Department of Justice filed formal charges against Brent Rollins, the city didn't explode, it eroded. There were no sirens, no news helicopters circling the courthouse, just the quiet, choking corrosion of a name once worn like armor, now spat like poison. The press release from the federal attorney's office was surgical, stripped of emotion, but its implications hit like artillery. Excessive force resulting in death, obstruction of justice, multiple counts of perjury, civil rights violations under color of law. The badge wasn't beside his name anymore. It was under evidence lockup. Rollins heard the news from a television in his hospital room. The nurse didn't tell him. The headline did. White font on a red ticker. Ex-officer, Rollins charged in Graves' case. He stared at it as if it were written in another language, as if it were about someone else. Then he screamed, a sound that cracked through the floor tiles and turned the ward silent. But no one came to check. They all heard it, and no one cared. The medals he once polished were gone. The uniform he once wore with pride had been folded and sealed in an evidence bag. The department removed his photo from the Wall of Valor and issued a quiet update to their website, noting pending disciplinary review, but screenshots of that wall, of Rollins shaking hands with the mayor, grinning under fluorescent lights, circulated like wanted posters. Under every photo, the comments flooded. "Delete this. He's not a hero. That's not justice, it's betrayal in uniform. People who once praised him now scrubbed his name like it was dirt under their nails. Former colleagues who toasted to his bravery under fire deleted their posts. Some archived them. Others issued vague apologies. We supported who we were told to. We didn't know. But the silence when Marcus Graves was buried had already spoken louder. In his hospital bed, Rollins demanded an interview. "I need to speak. People want to hear my side," he said to the nurse. She didn't reply. She adjusted his IV drip without looking him in the eye. The next morning, he called a local news station directly, insisted on airtime, and claimed he had a truth the media wouldn't touch. No one returned his call. 2 days later, he tried again. He was put on hold, then disconnected. What no one told him was this: the press wasn't boycotting him. They had simply moved on. From a man who used to command headlines to a figure no one wanted to be seen standing next to. Rollins still had access to a small mirror mounted across the room. He stared into it, watching the contours of his face shift with every twitch, every outburst. He tried rehearsing a speech. "I served with honor," he'd mutter. "I protected this city." But the words clung to his lips like mold, and the reflection didn't nod back. It just stared, hollow, rotten, like it knew the decay had already started. One night, a nurse walked past his room and heard the sound of flesh hitting tile. She opened the door and saw blood. Not much, but enough. Rollins had slammed his head into the wall. Not once, several times. His face was flushed. Breathing was erratic. "I used to be called a hero," he growled. "Do you know what that means? A hero! I saved people." She didn't answer. She called security. The report noted non-lethal self-inflicted behavior. Patient agitated. They strapped him in for observation. His wrists, once strong enough to choke air from civilians without fear of consequence, now bound by the very rules he'd sneered at. Elsewhere, the department received its first official request for reassignment from a junior officer. His reason? "I refuse to wear the same badge as Brent Rollins." That quote leaked. It went viral. Dante saw it on the news, sitting in the back of a quiet diner. The screen showed the officer's silhouette. His voice altered, but the conviction cut through the distortion like a scalpel. Across the table, someone asked Dante, "You think it's enough that the system's waking up?" Dante didn't look up from his coffee. He just said, "It's easy to rip a badge off a chest, harder to rip the rot out of a soul." He stirred the cup once, didn't drink it. That line was picked up by several outlets, misquoted, rearranged, and made poetic, but none of them understood its weight, because Dante hadn't spoken it for applause. He spoke it as if it were an autopsy note. Rollins's name was formally removed from the department's Medal of Merit archive. The internal memo wasn't circulated. It was leaked. A red-line correction ran across his citation. Revoked findings in violation of Civil Code 14.9. No ceremony, no replacement name. Just a void where a face used to be. His personnel file, once sealed, was now public, not by the department's choice, but by court order. It told a story Rollins had hoped would never see daylight. Reprimands, disguised as coaching. Field complaints are rerouted through friendly supervisors. A pattern of escalation. Violent arrests, over-policing black neighborhoods, unreported injuries that no one stopped because no one wanted to question a decorated officer. The narrative was no longer about whether he had snapped. It was about why he was never stopped. Journalists wrote think pieces. Sociologists cited case studies. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from their old statements, deleting tweets that called him a pillar of protection. And through it all, Rollins festered, not with remorse, but with rage. He wasn't sorry. He was abandoned. He wasn't reflecting. He was burning inside a cell of irrelevance. Every name that left his side wasn't a loss of friendship. It was betrayal in his mind, because he had believed, deep down, that the system would protect its soldiers, that if he wore the uniform long enough, brutalized the right people, played the part of enforcer well enough, he'd be untouchable. Instead, the mask was gone, and behind it wasn't a monster, just a man stripped of glory, grasping for a lie that no longer served him. When asked, weeks later, if he'd heard what Dante said on TV, he replied, "I don't listen to ghosts." But that wasn't true. He heard every word because in his dreams, he wasn't chasing criminals anymore. He was being followed by silence, by judgment, by a little boy's name carved into a grave Rollins would never visit. And worst of all, he knew the world no longer feared him. It pitied him. And to a man like Brent Rollins, that was the deepest rot of all. The weight of disgrace does not fall all at once. It drips, slow and steady, until the dam breaks. And, as Rollins's name was scrubbed from plaques and promotions, as his screams went unanswered in sterile hospital corridors, the rot began to seep into places once considered clean. That was when the cracks reached men like Samuel Price, a former internal affairs officer, a veteran, a man who once shared foxholes with Dante Graves and signatures with devils he thought were brothers. They called a hearing, another one, but this time it wasn't about Rollins. Not directly. It was about the people who let him grow like mold in silence, who signed papers and erased lines and slept soundly because they wore the same badge. Samuel walked into the congressional hall not like a man ready to defend himself, but like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His uniform hung loose now. His hands didn't shake from age, but from truth. The lights dimmed. Cameras rolled. The room hushed as he took the stand. He didn't greet anyone, didn't adjust the microphone, just inhaled once and spoke, voice bare. "My name is Samuel Price. I served 19 years as an internal affairs investigator. I served alongside Mr. Graves in Kandahar, and I signed the form that buried his son's case." There was no gasp, no one shouted. It was too cold for shock. He continued, eyes fixed somewhere between his own feet and some unseen horizon. "I saw the violation report. I read the accounts. I held the photographs in my hand, the ones with the blood still drying. I signed off on dismissal. I marked it, insufficient grounds for misconduct. I knew that wasn't true, but I also knew Rollins had friends and that I wore the same badge. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was surgical. Like the pause before an execution. From the back of the room, Dante stood, calm, composed. The room had seen him break bones and bend courtrooms, but this, Dante, was colder, more dangerous, because this one held no rage, only clarity. He walked forward slowly, reached into his jacket and pulled out a single folded paper. The edges were yellowed, one corner torn, ink slightly smudged like it had been held by fingers too long. He unfolded it and read aloud the line in question. "Subject did not exhibit signs of physical violence before incident." He didn't look at the room, just at Price. "Do you remember this, Sam?" His voice was low, but it rang across the room like a thrown blade. Samuel tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't shape the words, so Dante walked closer, not aggressively, deliberately. He handed the page to Samuel and said, "Can you read it again? Not as a cop, as a father." Price took the page. His hand shook. He blinked fast. Then again. But no words came out, only a rasp. His mouth moved, but there was no sound, and then he sat down, hard, shoulders collapsing like scaffolding torn loose. The page slipped from his fingers onto the table, landing face up with the damning sentence bold as a confession. No one clapped. No one comforted him, because this wasn't redemption, this wasn't catharsis, this was failure, standing on two legs, dressed in shame, and it was the truth that had dragged it here, not mercy. One of the committee members, a woman in her 50s with eyes that had probably seen too much too early, leaned forward. "Mr. Graves, do you have anything you wish to say to the witness?" Dante didn't hesitate. "He didn't bury my son, but he helped hide the shovel." His voice was flat. No hatred, no fire, just a fact, the kind that couldn't be washed out. Samuel Price didn't look up. The rest of the session unfolded like an autopsy, cold, precise. The room examined layers of negligence like muscle peeled from bone. Other names were read aloud. Officers who saw reports but asked no questions. supervisors who heard rumors but never followed up. Each one is now forced to watch their silence bloom into consequence. The public didn't need a narrative anymore. The evidence spoke louder than outrage. News outlets played the footage of Price breaking down on a loop, but the commentary was no longer about the man's tears. It was about the decades of silence that created them. Some said Price was brave for coming forward, but Dante refused that word. In a later interview, his only one in months, he said, "Bravery isn't when you speak after silence. Bravery is when you speak before it costs you something." And for Price, it had cost everything. He was suspended, not fired, not charged, because the system still knew how to protect its own, even when they confessed. But in the halls of public opinion, he became the face of complicity, the one who had a chance to stop a murder before it started, and instead signed his name at the bottom of a lie. In private, someone asked Dante why he hadn't attacked Price. Verbally, physically, emotionally. He replied, "You don't need to stab a man who's already bleeding out. You just make him look in a mirror." And in the weeks that followed, Price was seen less and less. He resigned quietly, declined interviews, moved out of the city. One reporter caught up to him months later. He wouldn't speak, just pointed to his old badge number etched on a belt buckle, then tossed it into a river. That belt buckle showed up on eBay 2 days later, selling for $12,000 before it was taken down. Symbolism has a strange price. Meanwhile, Dante continued to walk without needing applause. He didn't need a courtroom to validate his grief. He had already delivered the one punishment no court could offer: memory. He made them remember. Not just Rawlins, not just Price, but every quiet accomplice who turned paperwork into coffins. This wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't even an ending. It was a rupture, and from it poured everything people had tried to ignore until it was ink on record, voice on camera, face on screen. Dante's war hadn't ended, but in that room, on that day, one more mask had shattered. And in the broken pieces, the nation saw itself, not as heroes, not as protectors, but as architects of denial. And for once, it couldn't look away. The courtroom was colder than usual, not by degrees of temperature, but by the weight of what was about to be said aloud. Truly, finally, and for the first time. No cameras panned the room. No murmurs buzzed among the pews. Just that stillness, that unmistakable pause before something irreversible slices through time. The judge's voice, stern, deliberate, and reverent, cut the silence like a ritual invocation. Today's hearing regards the reopened case of Officer Brent Rawlins. Formal charge: homicide in the line of duty. Victim, Marcus Elijah Graves. No initials, no abbreviations, no John Doe. The full name, spoken in the sanctuary of the law, not as a footnote, not as an error in a spreadsheet, but as the central, irrefutable truth. Dante stood at the edge of the room, back straight, suit collar pressed as if it were armor. In his hands he held not a folder, not a file, but a small object, soft, faded, and unforgiving. A cotton cap, children's size, still stained with the deep brown halo of dried blood along the inner rim, where cartilage had once pulsed with life. The courtroom's attention turned to him not like a spotlight snapping on, but like a tide being pulled forward by gravity itself. He stepped forward only when addressed. His movements made no sound, yet they resounded louder than gavels. He placed the cap gently on the witness podium, not like evidence, but like burial. Again, the judge leaned in, the emotion nearly cracking through years of procedural detachment. "Mr. Graves," she said, "why have you held on to this?" Dante didn't blink. His voice carried like the edge of a blade wrapped in silk. Death. So the system would never forget the scent of death it chose to ignore. Rawlins wasn't in the room. He wasn't needed. His shadow hung in every document, every whispered recollection, every blood-slick line of testimony that had been sanitized by bureaucracy until it was white as fresh paper. But not today. Today there was no bleach strong enough to scrub away what Dante had come to say, not with words, but with the unbearable stillness of someone who's run out of illusion. The prosecution read through the revised charges. They didn't dwell on policy or protocol anymore. They read the new timeline, pointed to the precise second when Marcus had said, "I didn't do anything," and the officer had pulled the door open with a grunt. The defense lawyer tried to object, citing emotional manipulation, but even she couldn't keep her voice from wavering when the image of the bloodied cap remained in plain sight, an artifact immune to interpretation. Then came the display of evidence, a sequence of documents, previous testimonies, body cam stills, but all of it paled compared to that piece of fabric on the table. It didn't blink, it didn't rationalize, it existed, irrevocably, as proof that something innocent had once been alive and had bled. Rawlins's previous trial had made Marcus disappear into footnotes. Young male, possible suspect, non-compliant subject. This time, every record had been corrected. His name appeared on the indictment. His name was sewn into the court transcript. His name echoed in the hallways afterward, bouncing off walls like a bell toll, announcing the end of a lie. Dante never raised his voice. He didn't cry. He didn't explain. He simply answered each question like he was cleaning a tombstone, with care, precision, and unflinching certainty. When asked why he refused to settle out of court, he responded, "Because my son didn't get to settle for a lesser blow. He got the full sentence, without trial." Reporters, though excluded from the trial, had gathered outside, waiting for any scrap of insight, and when the clerk brought out the updated case title and pinned it to the docket board, People versus Brent Rawlins, homicide victim Marcus Elijah Graves, a photograph was snapped. It wasn't the clerk. It wasn't even on the board. It was of Dante, standing beside the posted paper, hands at his sides, not triumphant, not broken, just solid. Anchored, a man who had made the world say his child's name with clarity. Finally. Back in the courtroom, one last exchange shattered the air like thunder. The defense tried to argue that the officer's intent could not be proven malicious. It was a high-pressure situation, she insisted, and in that heat mistakes can happen. Dante turned, not quickly, but with the weight of a 1,000-yard stare behind his eyes. A mistake, he said, is spilling coffee, not crushing a child's skull and clocking out for lunch. Gasps followed. The judge did not silence them. For once, decorum bowed to truth. Before leaving the stand, Dante looked at the judge, not as a subordinate, but as an equal demanding accountability. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm not here to make you feel sympathy. I'm here so you never forget the difference between paperwork and a person. That cap," he gestured to the blood-stained cloth, "that's not a symbol. It's a wound. Still open, still speaking." The judge nodded, ever so slightly. Not an endorsement, not absolution, but acknowledgement, perhaps the rarest currency a grieving father could ever be paid in. As he stepped down, the court sat frozen. For once, no rush to adjourn, no eager hands reaching for briefcases, just the ghost of a boy's name lingering in the air, unwilling to vanish again. Marcus Elijah Graves, spoken, documented, recognized. It would be easy to call it justice, but Dante didn't. He didn't speak to reporters, didn't claim a win. As he exited the courthouse, he walked alone, the same way he entered. No applause, no salute, just footsteps trailing behind silence. He paused only once, in the courtyard, glancing upward as if checking whether the sky itself had heard the name read aloud. He placed the cap back in his coat pocket, where the blood wouldn't stain anything new, not because he needed to hold on, but because someone had to carry the truth, and the truth was heavier than any verdict. The courtroom had been scrubbed clean of blood, but not of memory. The echo of Dante's footfalls was gone now, replaced by the steady hum of bureaucratic process, the rustle of suits, the sterile tap of gavels and whispers. And yet, what remained was heavier than the silence after violence. It was the weight of complicity, freshly unwrapped. 3 court officers, uniforms still neatly pressed, names once forgotten, were now thrust under the floodlight of consequence. The footage, the reports, the freeze frame of Rawlins' fist colliding with Dante's jaw and their frozen stares, those had returned, not with vengeance, But with audit, they had stood, they had watched, they had done nothing. And now they were summoned, not as protectors, not as witnesses, as enablers. One broke first. A clerk named Harold Fitch, 57, 2 kids, 1 pension plan, and a silence that used to feel like safety. He submitted a public letter. No PR filter, no legal polishing, raw, typed at midnight, posted to a government forum where apologies go to die or explode. I saw it, the letter read. I saw the punch. I saw the man hit the ground. I saw his eyes, not afraid, just tired. And I saw mine reflected in them, blank, complicit. I stood still. I did nothing. And now they call me a collaborator. They're right. The post was meant to disappear into the tide of noise, but it didn't. It got picked up, reposted, clipped into reels with background piano music, and overlaid with hashtags. One veteran-turned-teacher read it aloud to a class of high schoolers in Georgia. One senator read it into the congressional record. One mother printed it and taped it above her son's locker with the words, "This is what silence becomes." When the letter was broadcast live, Dante sat in a modest studio, no stage lights, just a single cam and a folded piece of paper in his hand. He didn't blink often. He didn't smile. He read each word with a pace that could grind bone. Then, folding it again, he placed it flat on the desk, his hand pressing on the crease like pressing on an old wound. "I forgive you," Dante said, "but I will never forget where you stood." There was no applause, no orchestral swell, no commentator cutting in, just his voice, final and direct. Not a sermon, a sentence, and it hit like a closed door on a burning house. Within a week, the letter became the official curriculum across 3 state agencies. It was reclassified from public apology to required reading. Civil service trainees, law enforcement cadets, even judiciary interns, all of them now had to confront Fitch's confession before receiving credentials. It was renamed The Weight of Watching. One of the other 2 court officers, a woman named Sandra Lyle, remained silent, not in defiance, but in paralysis. Her lawyer advised her not to speak. Her pastor begged her to. Her daughter, 17, left her a note on the breakfast counter. "If you won't say something now, I'll always wonder who you are." The 3rd officer resigned, quietly, no statement, just a line in the news ticker. But Dante's words remained, not the loud ones, but the ones he never had to raise his voice for. They replayed online endlessly, clipped, stitched, and dissected. They weren't just a father's rage, they were a ledger, a reckoning. The system didn't just punish the guilty, it began questioning the passive, the bystanders, those who held doors for injustice because they wore a badge or a tie. Committees debated adding inaction in the presence of excessive force to the misconduct registry. One congresswoman quoted Dante during a hearing, "He didn't demand justice, he demanded memory, and that's what made it powerful." This wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was legacy warfare, the kind where the battlefield isn't bloodied pavement, but the paper trail behind silence, where the enemy isn't just the man with the gun, but the man with the clipboard who looked away. Rollins remained behind reinforced walls, untouched by this round of justice, but his ghost walked every frame of the footage now used in legal training. His voice, once smug, was now Exhibit A in every case study on how a man can wear a uniform and rot from the inside out. And the silence of those who watched him rot, it screamed now. The Justice Department issued a memo. Silence in the presence of violence is not neutrality, it is alignment. The phrase trended. The public didn't move on. They moved in, into hearings, petitions, and panels. They demanded names, not just of those who acted, but of those who didn't. And Dante, he remained mostly off-screen, but his shadow grew larger, not as a hero, but as a mirror. Every official who sat in those chairs had to ask themselves, if I had been there, would I have flinched, or stood, or helped? He never asked that aloud. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer about grief. It was a verdict. The courtroom was no longer a battleground. It had become a monument. Every hallway, every bench, Every plaque bolted into marble now echoed with the sound of a single name, Graves. Not just a man who stood, fought, and endured, but a boy who never got the chance. Marcus Elijah Graves. His name was no longer smeared across incident reports or whispered through clenched teeth by those too afraid to speak the truth. It was etched bold and unignorable at the top of a bill that threatened to crack open the ribs of a system that had armored itself in silence for generations. The Graves Act, 4 syllables that burned into public consciousness like a brand. Cameras would roll. Body cams would not blink, not anymore. A clause in the legislation stated that disabling a body cam during duty hours would now be prosecuted as a felony obstruction of justice. No more convenient glitches, no more dark spots in digital memory. For once, memory would be made mandatory. But Dante had never asked for any of this. He hadn't stood before Congress, hadn't delivered a speech, hadn't posed for press photos holding the pen that signed the bill into law. The invitation came, of course, a leather-bound letter from the governor's office, lined in gold foil, stamped with the seal of justice that had done too little for too long. The press would have devoured the image, the father, stone-faced and proud, standing at the edge of history as the ink dried over his son's name. But Dante said no. His hands had held that name when it still had warmth. He wasn't about to use it now for claps. Reporters speculated. Was it grief, pride, protest? None of them understood the man they tried to narrate. Only one quote made it to print, a single sentence he said, quietly, when a journalist caught him outside a Veterans Hall in Westwood, brushing sand from the soles of his boots. "I'm not glad my son's name is on a law," Dante said. "I'll be glad when no one else's has to be on a gravestone." That line struck harder than any statute, and suddenly it was everywhere, on banners, pinned above protest stages, on signs raised at vigils, on school walls, printed across civics class posters. It echoed, not because it was poetic, but because it was carved from truth. It did not demand applause. It dared people to look away. Inside the Capitol, the bill passed with a near-unanimous vote. Even those who once turned their backs couldn't muster the gall to say no to a dead boy's name. One senator, known for his hardline stance on law and order, delivered a stuttering yes, his voice cracking when he remembered his grandson wore the same sneakers Marcus had on when he died. Another, teary-eyed but sharp, stood to declare, "This law will not bring Marcus Graves back, but it will stop the darkness from swallowing another." And yet, Dante wasn't there to hear it. He sat alone that night, far from the marble rotundas and congratulatory speeches. A half-finished plate of cold food rested untouched at his elbow. The glow from a muted television washed over his face, casting long shadows down the creases of a man who had walked through fire, not for glory, but because the other side held something still breathing. In his lap lay a copy of the legislation, thick, stapled, impersonal, black ink on white paper. Nothing about it felt human. He thumbed through the pages until he reached the last clause. There it was, his son's name, the act's official title, Graves' Accountability Mandate for Law Enforcement Recording Systems. They made sure every syllable sounded official, distant, and clean. It read like something crafted by people who'd never heard a child's skull crack against metal, never sat in a morgue chair with a pen, forced to circle one name on a form beneath the word next of kin. He folded the document carefully, as if it might tear if mishandled, not out of reverence, but because even paper had bones. Elsewhere, lawmakers celebrated. Think pieces bloomed like weeds. News anchors called it a watershed moment in racial justice reform, a political win, a national awakening. But for Dante, it was none of that. It wasn't a chapter. It wasn't closure. It wasn't even justice. It was pressure, accumulated pain transmuted into policy. A single law born not from consensus, but from a kick that shattered not just a man's ribcage, but the illusion of silence. He hadn't planned that kick. It wasn't rage. It wasn't vengeance. It was a muscle memory, drawn from deserts and doorways where hesitation got men killed. When Rawlins swung, Dante didn't react. He recalibrated, delivered the kind of strike that wasn't meant for a courtroom, but it landed there anyway. And now, that bootprint had shape-shifted into legislation. The irony stung like metal. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn piece of cloth, gray hue frayed at the corners, a blood stain blooming faintly along the edge. His son's shirt. He kept it not because it brought peace, but because it reminded him of war, of what it cost, of what laws were too late to stop. The world didn't stop because a law changed. Patrol cars still prowled through neighborhoods where porch lights stayed on all night, not for welcome, but for warning. Uniforms still walked with their chests out, radios crackling, hands brushing too close to triggers. The Graves Act didn't erase suspicion, it only documented it. But now, suspicion had eyes. Across 3 counties, officers gathered for mandatory retraining. Rooms once filled with rote presentations now showed Marcus's video before anything else. Not the edited clip that had once played in court, but the full recording. Raw, unblinking, cruel in its clarity. The room always fell silent at the same line. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus had said, voice cracking, barely more than a whisper. Then the metal-on-metal sound. Then the thud. Then black. No one coughed. No one took notes. An instructor stood in front of the silence and said, "If you ever turn off your camera, ask yourself, what are you afraid it will see?" The training manual included a new section. Page 1, the Graves Act. Page 2, a printed copy of Dante's statement. Not a speech, just words he had sent in scrawled penmanship, refusing any edits. "You're not being watched, you're being remembered." The phrase settled like ash. Some officers looked down, a few looked angry, but 1 or 2, always the youngest, looked changed. Meanwhile, cable networks moved on. The news cycle spun toward new chaos. Elections, scandals, celebrity downfalls, hashtags trended, faded, and vanished. But the law held, quiet, steady, like a low drumbeat beneath the noise. And somewhere in the stillness, something cracked. Not in the system, but in those who had once looked away. Months later, under an iron sky, Dante stood at the edge of a stage he hadn't asked for. It was a town hall, hastily arranged, no banners, no anthem, just a single mic on a wooden box and folding chairs filled with people who didn't wear suits but carried weight heavier than titles. Mothers, veterans, teachers, young men with restless legs and bruised memories. Behind Dante, pinned to the wall, was a laminated copy of the Graves Act. Above it, someone had spray-painted in thick black strokes, "Not a gift," a warning. He didn't step to the microphone. He stepped past it. His voice didn't need amplification. The silence in the room had already hollowed out every corner. He held up Marcus's shirt. The same frayed cloth, the blood now rust-colored from time, and he didn't wave it like a symbol. He simply showed it, let it exist in their view, let them imagine what it meant to press that fabric to their chest, and smell what law books never printed. A young man near the back stood, asked shakily, "Do you think it made a difference?" Dante answered without pause. "It stopped one kind of death, not all of them." Then he added, "But that's how it begins." At that moment, in that room, something happened. It wasn't applause, it wasn't chance, it wasn't even noise. It was resolved, sharp, grounded, cold like forged steel. Not the heat of revenge, but the clarity of recognition. The Graves Act wasn't an end, it was a front line. Not everyone would walk it, but no one could say they didn't know it was there. And in a federal building miles away, beneath bulletproof glass and fluorescent lights, a plaque was being installed beside the bill itself. Etched in matte steel, it bore Dante's final words to the legislation committee, the only sentence he ever allowed to be associated with the passage of the law. A law written in a dead child's name better live like it means something. Then he turned away from the room, from the past, from the myth they tried to build around his silence. He left the cloth behind. The cloth was left behind, but its weight followed him. Not in his hands anymore, but in every headline, in every classroom module, in every quiet nod exchanged between strangers who now understood the price of silence. Dante never returned to the capital. He didn't need to. The work had already moved beyond those stone walls, and yet the shadow of one name refused to stay buried: Rawlins. Even as the system cracked, even as statutes bore the bloodied signature of consequence, some still flinched at the thought of seeing his name in full print. The hospital where he was detained removed the metal placard on his door. Just an empty holder remained, sterile and hollow. On the official docket for his arraignment, he was listed by initials only, BR, with the notation, redacted for humanitarian review, a cruelty wrapped in courtesy, an erasure disguised as mercy. Dante saw the headline and didn't blink. He wrote a single-page petition and sent it to the federal judge presiding over the case. No lawyer, no press release. Just one sentence in black ink. If compassion means shielding a murderer's name, then give me back my son. It hit harder than any argument. The court debated, reviewed, and hesitated, but the weight of public pressure was undeniable. Across forums and editorial columns, the debate raged. Why protect the identity of a man whose violence had been public, recorded, and legally proven? Why offer grace to a uniform when the child beneath it had none? The judge ruled 2 days later. Rawlins' full name would be reinstated on every official document, past and future. His initials would not be enough to veil the acts they now represented. He would not be anonymized into myth. He would not be afforded the dignity of vagueness. Footage of the nameplate being screwed back onto the hospital room door aired on every major network. It was grainy, handheld, and unsensational, but it gripped the nation tighter than any press conference. A young nurse, visible only from the back, reached up, locked the nameplate into place, then stepped aside. The camera zoomed in. Brent Rawlins. The letters weren't gold. They were matte black, etched into tarnished steel. Unremarkable. And somehow, in that plainness, more damning than any courtroom insult. There was no ceremony, no apology. Just cold metal returning to a space that had pretended it could forget. For a moment, it felt like the building itself exhaled. The plaque didn't scream guilt. It whispered something worse. Remembrance with purpose. A label that would not be allowed to fade. The evening news closed with a voiceover from a female anchor, her tone level but her eyes glassy. Dante Graves never asked for revenge. He asked for clarity. He didn't want Brent Rawlins humiliated. He just didn't want him remembered like a victim. The sentence lingered, playing in loops across every social feed and network recap. It was replayed in podcasts, quoted in opinion pieces, and dissected in classrooms. And it landed differently on each ear, depending on what side of silence you'd once stood. The statement cut through the screen. It left no place for romanticizing violence. No comfort in obscurity. No silence in place of accountability. It peeled away the last protective gauze from the myth of the uniform. In this country, a name could be a badge, or it could be a verdict. Rawlins had carried it like a weapon. Now it hung like a chain. In a prison upstate, Rawlins received the news alone. The guards had stopped calling him by his last name. Now it was just a number. He asked for the TV to be turned off. It stayed on. No one acknowledged his discomfort. They weren't cruel. They were simply pretending he deserved neutrality. He tore the pages from a magazine someone left in the day room. The articles inside weren't about him, but they didn't need to be. They were about systems, about names, about change. And to a man like Rawlins, the fact that he wasn't the subject anymore, that was a new kind of punishment. Relevance decayed faster than guilt. Outside, the world moved. Not in marches this time, not in fury, but in curriculum changes, in departmental memos, in courtroom language where names like Marcus Elijah Graves were spoken not as footnotes, but as anchors. A group of students at a local university began work on a mural. They painted names of those whose stories had ended in cold cement and sealed autopsy drawers. Names history tried to forget. Names once pushed to the margins of paperwork and memory. And in a corner, small but deliberate, They left a square blank. Beneath it, they scrawled in thick, unforgiving paint, "This space is reserved for those who think anonymity erases truth." They didn't need to name Rawlins. His absence was the accusation. His silence is the testimony. The blankness, in its way, was louder than ink. At a panel discussion on public trust and police transparency, a retired district attorney was asked whether naming offenders so publicly set a dangerous precedent. She paused, then said, "Only if you believe the truth is dangerous." The room didn't clap. It didn't need to. The idea stood on its own. Dante never visited that mural. He didn't need to. He knew the difference between being forgotten and being unseen, and now so did everyone else. He watched interviews from a distance, heard strangers speak his son's name with reverence but also with intent. Marcus wasn't just a boy lost anymore. He was a name on a law, a line in a case study, a reason someone else got to walk away from a stop alive. Justice hadn't come clean, but it had stopped pretending to be blind, and sometimes Dante thought, that was where real change started, not with miracles, but with truth made visible. He wasn't interested in legacies. He didn't trust statues. But when a child somewhere asked a teacher what the Graves Act was, and the answer came without shame or denial, that was enough. And for the first time in a long time, that was something close to victory. Not the kind shouted in courts or chiseled into marble. A quieter victory, one made of erasures undone, of silences replaced with names that could no longer be scrubbed out. Rawlins was no longer just a man who had done a monstrous thing. He was a record, a reference, a reminder. The law didn't give Dante peace. Nothing could. But it gave him precision. It gave him a country forced to read back its lies in black and white. He didn't need to speak Rawlins' name again. Now the world would do it, for the right reasons, with the right context, no longer as a symbol of authority, but as a warning carved into law, broadcast in textbooks, remembered through consequences. And maybe that was the most honest kind of justice. Not the fall of the guilty, but the rise of the truth they tried to bury. The name Rawlins was no longer protected. It was studied, cited, framed not as an exception, but as a pattern. The plaque that once bore his name was now a signal, not of honor, but of how long it took the system to admit who he was. And Dante? He didn't return to Capitol Hill. He didn't need to testify again. He wasn't a fixture of protest or platform. He was a father who had walked into the jaws of a machine and forced it to spell the truth, letter by letter, on national record. When reporters asked for comment months later, he didn't answer. He mailed a photograph instead, a shot of Marcus's cloth cap, laid next to a new student ID from a local school, named in the boy's honor. No caption, none needed. The letter arrived folded in half, no envelope, no return address. Just crayon on notebook paper, shaky block letters at the top. Dear Mr. Graves. It didn't come with fanfare or ceremony. It wasn't framed or delivered by an official courier. A neighbor's kid found it tucked in the mailbox next to the circular ads and water bill. They gave it to Dante over the fence like it was nothing. But it wasn't anything. He waited until the house was quiet. No more buzz from reporters. No more knocks from advocates or invitations to sit on panels he never asked to join. Just him, the wooden kitchen table, and a letter that weighed more than any verdict ever handed down. He unfolded it slowly, as if the paper might snap. The handwriting belonged to a 10-year-old boy, Marcus's age, when he first rode a bike without help. No corrections, no filter, no legalese, just truth, raw and clumsy. They almost put me in the back of a car. Said I matched someone. I didn't. I said no. I said I didn't do anything wrong. And they let me go because the camera was on, because of you. Thank you. I want to be like you. Dante didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stared. The words didn't lift him. They didn't comfort. They burned. Each one like a match struck against memory, flaring briefly and brightly before turning black. He read the letter once. Then again, until the paper felt thinner, the ink more permanent. Then he folded it precisely, tore it in two, then four, then 8, then more. He opened the rusted tin on the back porch, where Marcus once hid firecrackers and bottle caps. He set the pieces inside, struck a match, lit the paper, watched it curl and turn to ash. He whispered, low and steady, "I don't want to be your hero. I just wanted to be his father." That night, the city council held a final vote to rename a park in honor of Dante. He didn't attend. They passed it anyway. The mayor gave a speech. People clapped. Journalists filed clean copy with words like legacy and justice served. The camera panned to an empty front row, a folded chair where his name had been printed in bold. He wasn't there. He was home, not praying, not drinking, just sitting in the dark, watching the last ember of a letter disappear in smoke. Because justice wasn't applause. It wasn't a plaque. It wasn't a building name. It was the silence that followed when you ran out of lies. No cheers, no closing speech. Just a man and the one truth he could still control. That this pain, this loss, would never become performance. Because the system had tried to flatten Marcus into a file, a statistic, another blurry face in a thick report. Dante refused to let that be the ending. He didn't want martyrdom. He wanted a world where boys didn't become hashtags before they became men. And if that world wouldn't come, he'd burn every thank you note until it learned how to grieve. Not celebrate, not forget, just grieve, quietly, fully, with no applause. The footage from that empty chair made its rounds. Cable news played it on loop, trying to extract meaning from absence. A commentator said, "His silence is louder than any speech we've heard this year." But Dante hadn't meant to make a statement. He meant to be left alone. Still, they wouldn't stop calling. Universities asked if he'd speak to criminal justice students. NGOs wanted him to endorse reform campaigns. A best-selling author offered to co-write his memoir. Dante said no to each one. Every time. Because this wasn't about building something on Marcus's grave. It was about keeping what was left untouched, unsold, undiluted. He didn't need anyone to understand. He just needed them to stop packaging grief like merchandise. Meanwhile, the park, renamed in his honor, had a new sign installed. Beneath the metal plate, a child laid sunflowers. The petals were uneven, cut with scissors. Someone posted a photo online. It went viral. The caption read, "A man who said nothing, so we could hear everything." Dante saw it. He didn't share it. He didn't even save it. He turned off the screen. Because nothing anyone could post would bring back the warmth of a child's breath on his shoulder, or the way Marcus used to hum under his breath when nervous, or the way he asked questions, 100 a day, always beginning with, "But what if? What if he hadn't been in that car? What if the camera hadn't been off? What if the name Graves never had to mean a grave?" He would carry those what-ifs forever, like a soldier with shrapnel buried deep, invisible but constant. Pain that never screamed, only whispered when it rained. And it always rained now, even when the sun was out. They asked again, through formal letters this time, whether he would accept a national award for civic resilience. The White House offered to fly him in. Prime seats, a handshake, a mention in the president's speech. The same country that sent him to war now wanted to frame his grief with a medal. Dante didn't reply. He took the envelope, still sealed, and placed it inside the box where he kept his son's last drawing. He never opened either. One morning, a journalist waiting outside the gate shouted, "Don't you think this country owes you something?" Dante paused, looked at him, not with anger, with exhaustion, then said, "It owed my son a future." He didn't yell, he didn't slam the gate, he just closed it softly, like shutting a wound before it bled again. That night, he sat on the porch steps. Wind brushes dried leaves across the concrete. No camera, no mic, just memory. He thought of Marcus, not how he died, but how he once sang to the dog, off-key and fearless. How he argued about dinosaurs with his whole chest. How he asked, just once, "Dad, what happens when the good guys don't win?" Dante had answered then, "Sometimes they don't, but they don't stop being good." Now, alone in the dark, he whispered the same words to no one, because the war wasn't over. It had just gone quiet, and quiet didn't mean peace. Not yet, but it was a start. Rollins stood as the judge's voice echoed off the marble walls. 27 years. The courtroom didn't gasp, no cries, no protest, just the dull sound of a gavel closing a chapter that had already bled itself dry. He turned, wrists shackled, the press cameras flashing not for him, but for the absence in the front row. Dante wasn't there. The chair where Dante had sat before, rigid, still, filled with quiet fury, was now just empty wood. Rollins scanned it with a smirk, trying to surface, but it died before it reached his lips. He was searching for a final battle, but his enemy had already left the field. The silence weighed more than the sentence. His name was called for the last time, clearly, completely. No initials. The court clerk made sure of it. Brant Anthony Rollins. Full. Exposed. Archived. Outside, the world didn't cheer. There were no parades, no hashtags trending this time, only a photo, one frame. It traveled farther than any live feed could reach. Dante, in civilian clothes, not uniform, standing before a small, square gravestone. His hand rested gently atop it, fingers spread across the worn marble. The veins in his forearm were taut, as if holding something in place. His eyes were closed. His lips are unmoving. The caption beneath read, "He didn't go to court. He went where justice ends and memory begins." A young reporter approached him later that evening, cautious, reverent. "Why didn't you go?" she asked. Dante looked up, voice steady as stone. "I went where I was needed. The court doesn't need me anymore. It needs to remember." Those words circled newsrooms like smoke from a match. Quiet, acrid, unforgettable. The line became more than a quote. It became a wall. A final boundary that Dante drew between vengeance and victory. He hadn't come to watch Rollins be caged. He had come to feel Marcus's name in his palm, carved in cold rock, and know it would never be forgotten again. The prosecutor had offered him a front row seat. The mayor offered a private escort, even a private chamber, to wait for the verdict to be read. Dante declined each offer without fanfare, without explanation. He didn't need a ceremony. He didn't need to witness Rollins's caging to know the war was over. The judge, in a later interview, admitted his unease when speaking the sentence aloud without the father present. It felt like reading the last line of a book to an empty room, he confessed. But Dante didn't need the gavel to tell him what had been won or lost. He had already served the longest sentence imaginable, life without parole. Inside the courtroom, as Rollins turned to be escorted away, his eyes darted across the gallery again, searching for the man he once tried to break. There was no one. The bailiff didn't meet his eyes. The guards didn't speak. They moved efficiently, hands practiced but uninterested. Rollins stumbled slightly on the courtroom steps, the chain on his ankles clinking sharply against the marble. No one reached out to help. He turned, looking for a friendly face. There were none. The journalists didn't lift their cameras. One of them, a veteran reporter, quietly capped his pen and whispered, "We're done writing him." Outside the courthouse, a quiet crowd had gathered. Not of protest, not of celebration, but of reckoning. Students stood with handmade signs. Not for Dante, not even for Marcus, for themselves. One girl, barely 15, held a placard that said, "Don't erase the name." Another, written in Sharpie across a brown cardboard box, "Never again silent." They weren't shouting, they weren't chanting. They stood in silence, a line of still resistance stretching from the courthouse steps to the edge of the street. Their presence was not loud, but it rang, because somewhere along the line, silence had stopped meaning indifference. Now it meant intent, and the man who had made them brave enough to stand still wasn't even there. Dante, instead, walked alone beneath an autumn sky, leaves brittle beneath his boots, the air thick with dusk. The cemetery path wasn't long, but it felt carved through time. He passed the names of strangers, the echoes of forgotten men. Then he reached Marcus. Not just a name now, but a moment the country would never fully wash away. He didn't kneel. He didn't weep, he just placed his palm over the marble, the hand that once held rifles, that once carried bleeding brothers through fire. That same hand now trembled, barely, only when resting against his boy's name. He didn't say a word, there was no need. The wind moved, brushing dry grass. Somewhere far, a crow called once. The air around him folded inward. Memory didn't speak. It pressed. He stood there until the sun dipped and the stone turned cold beneath his hand. Then, with the same discipline that once moved him through war zones, he straightened, dusted the corner of the grave with his sleeve, and whispered, "It's done." But what he meant, and what only he knew, was this: it's begun. Across the country, the image of Dante at the graveside overtook the courtroom sketch. It was picked up not as a symbol of grief, but as proof of endurance. Editorials tried to romanticize it, calling him the silent flame of justice, the father who wouldn't kneel. But the ones who understood the photo didn't describe it at all. They just stared, because in that image there was no victory, no closure. Just a man whose spine held the weight of too many things left unsaid, and a piece of granite that carried more truth than a courtroom ever could. In interviews, politicians tiptoed around the sentencing. Some praised it, others called it long overdue, but none of them said Rawlins's name. That too had been taken from him. Not erased, but reduced. In every formal release, he was the defendant, the convicted. Never again, officer. Never again, hero. One press secretary even slipped and said, "Mr. Graves' son was murdered by the accused," before correcting herself, stammering, "It didn't matter. The slip had already told the truth." Dante didn't correct anyone. He never appeared on a talk show, never wrote a memoir, never signed a petition. He just moved back into his small house, fixed the broken step out front, and took down the photo of himself in uniform that once hung in the living room. In its place, he nailed up something else, a framed copy of Marcus's handwriting. Sloppy, uneven, but legible. "I'm not scared," it read, scrawled across a torn notebook page from his third-grade journal. Dante had found it folded inside a shoebox weeks after the funeral. Now it lived on the wall, facing the door, greeting every guest, if any dared knock. When asked later why he didn't frame a photo of Marcus instead, Dante replied, "Because his face is mine. I see it every day." But that sentence, that's his voice, and I don't want it to stop. Elsewhere, in school classrooms, ethics training programs, and police academies, Rawlins's trial became a case study, but never by name. Instead, it was titled "Systemic Complicity and the Failure of Internal Oversight." A new instructor's manual referred to him as Subject R. His mugshot wasn't shown, his commendations weren't mentioned. It was not about shame, it was about intentional forgetting, the kind of forgetting that comes after too much remembering. In one course, a young cadet raised his hand and asked, "Why don't we use his name?" The instructor paused, then wrote a single line on the board. "Some names don't deserve echo." The class didn't clap. They didn't have to. They understood. History is not about volume. It's about choice. What we choose to carry, what we choose to bury. And somewhere, in a small home no longer on the news map, Dante Graves sat in his backyard under an old oak tree, oiling a rusted bicycle chain. It wasn't Marcus's bike, just one he'd found at a thrift store, but he fixed it anyway, because some things, broken long ago, still deserved to be whole. When the morning Rawlins was moved to federal prison, there were no crowds, no helicopters, no one was waiting at the gate. His name was printed once, in the corner of a newspaper beneath the obituaries, not in bold, not in ink meant to last, just there, like a line. The world had finally stopped reading. Inside the transport van, he asked the guard, "They're not filming this?" The guard didn't reply, just adjusted his gloves and looked ahead. In the warden's logbook, he became inmate 22,749K. No title, no prefix, no suffix. His room had no nameplate, only a headreek. A small procedural change, quietly passed, ensured that officers dismissed for criminal conduct could no longer receive formal mention in retirement rolls. Rawlins's name would never again be read aloud in any honor roll ceremony. There would be no flag folded for him, no final radio call. Back in town, in the place where it all started, the bench outside the courthouse was repainted. Not with fanfare, just a maintenance worker in a blue jumpsuit, roller brushing over years of names scratched into wood. One of them had once said B.A. Rawlins in shaky penknife cuts. Now it was gone. No plaque, no quote. Just clean the slats of wood, ready for someone else's waiting. And in the same city, a little boy sat in the back seat of his mother's car, holding a lunchbox and watching the courthouse as they drove past. "Is that the place where the man got in trouble?" he asked. His mother hesitated, then nodded. "Kind of. That's the place where a boy's name was finally said, right?" That night, the photo of Dante's hand on Marcus's grave was printed again, this time on the inside of a school textbook under a chapter titled, "When the System Listens." There was no date, no footnote, just the image and one caption underneath. "Justice does not shout, it remembers." And Dante? He didn't know. He didn't ask. He sat on his porch, eyes on the street, waiting for no one. A dog barked in the distance. Wind brushed past the wind chime that never rang because he never hung it. The house was quiet, but in the quiet there was something new. Something Marcus might have called peace. He went inside, turned off the porch light, and closed the door with a click so soft it barely disturbed the silence. No audience watched. No credits rolled. But if they had, they might have read, "The last one to leave the courtroom never stood in it."